The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the Chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on FY 2022 budget and U.S.-Africa relations. Today we will discuss the policy priorities, strategies, and planned initiatives that the U.S. government has for Africa. U.S. engagement toward Africa is vital towards U.S. national security, and members will look to hear how the budget for Africa will help enhance overall engagement with the continent, strengthen health infrastructure, the trade and investment agenda, peace and security assistance, and development programs. I think this administration has taken steps to transition from aid assistance to Africa to mutually beneficial trade by revamping Prosper Africa, organizing another U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit next summer, and showing continued support to the African Union and its policies, including the AFCTA. Under the Prosper Africa program, this year's budget request includes $80 million toward the initiative to substantially increase the two-way U.S.-African trade and investment, which is a win for both sides. I understand there is an increase in funding, but I would like to know if the funding is sufficient in helping the continent thrive. For U.S. businesses to engage across Africa, they need political stability, ease of banking, and transparent business environments. As of this November, Prosper Africa had reportedly helped close about 800 trade and investments transactions worth an estimated $50 billion in 45 African countries. This is a promising start, but I'm hoping we can double and triple those numbers in the coming year with a focused agenda. It is important to focus also on U.S. support to Africa for COVID-19 vaccination and response, especially given the new variant in South Africa. This week, I was actually supposed to lead a U.S. delegation to the African Investment Forum, but it was canceled due to the variant impacting Southern Africa. The continent now more than ever needs consistent vaccines to distribute to everyone who needs them and the ability to manufacture their own. And this administration has pledged $4 billion for COVAX to provide 470 million vaccine doses by the end of the year. The pandemic affects all of us, and we are all in this together. The continent also has the largest untapped market of young consumers in the world, and it must be a priority for U.S. national security. To counter the threat of violent extremism, young people must stay politically engaged, believe in the rule of law, free speech, freedom of the press, and assembly. A deterrent of violent behavior would be to have access to primary, quality, and secondary education, and making sure communities are not food insecure. We also need to continue to provide opportunities for young professionals through the YALI program and Mandela Washington Fellowship. That's why I introduced and passed in the House H.R. 965, the YALI Act, to strengthen young leaders' knowledge and skills at U.S. institutions, have them connect with other Africans from different countries, and ensure they can harness their skills and take them back home and strengthen their businesses, public and private spaces. I know most of Africa's budget goes towards health programs, but I'm hoping that we can allocate more resources to trade and investment, education, and security. Although I push for trade versus aid, I understand every country is not economically equal on the continent. In terms of stability, I understand that $1 billion of the budget request would go toward development and economic assistance, with more than 1/3 primarily under the Feed the Future initiative that I am hoping can be expanded. I want to thank our witnesses, the Honorable Molly Fee, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs at the Department of State, and Dr. Diana Putman, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for East Africa and for the Office of Development Planning at USAID. I also want to thank the staff of the State Department and USAID for their excellent support of CODEL's Codels that I've been on and Codels that other people have been on. I'm always impressed by their support, knowledge, and dedication. And that said, I'm looking forward to your testimony and the discussion surrounding it. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. I do want to thank our distinguished chairwoman, Karen Bass, for convening today's very important hearing, and for the appearance of our witnesses, Assistant Secretary Molly Fee and Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator Diana Putman. I want to note parenthetically, it's good to see Molly Fee. I was visiting with her on a delegation trip to South Sudan when some of the worst atrocities had been occurring, and she was very bravely standing up and doing the best she could possibly do to protect, obviously, the South Sudanese, but also Americans who were there. So I do want to commend her for that, and it's great to see you again, Molly. Today, December 1st, is, as we all know, World AIDS Day, and it's worth remembering how much of an impact our PEPFAR program started under President George W. Bush and continued very seamlessly through administration after administration. The impact it has had on so many Africans, saving lives, saving children through mother-to-child transmission, and then the whole preventive piece, which has had incredible positive results. I would like to hear from our witnesses about how COVID, and in particular the new Omicron variant from South Africa, is impacting our fight against AIDS, as well as how it is impacting on the health and well-being of men and women in Africa, and also on tuberculosis and malaria, as well as affecting our ability to focus on other humanitarian concerns, among which has been the desert locust crisis in East Africa. I know parenthetically that Karen Bass and I have authored legislation to focus on that issue. My hope is that we don't get a redo of it. If we do enough preventive and preemptively, we can help mitigate that problem as well. Well, today's hearing is about the budget. It's also about policy. Where we put our money reflects what we value, and getting the correct policy in place must inform our budget. To that end, I would like our witnesses in particular to address what is unfolding in two absolutely critical countries in Africa, Nigeria and Ethiopia, both of which play an outsized role on the continent. As I said at the hearing this past September, Nigeria is on the verge of disintegration, which I believe is attributable principally to President Buhari's Fulani ethno-religious chauvinism. I am concerned that whether our State Department adequately is addressing this, as well as the appearance of acquiescence to the Buhari government's not-so-tacit support of militancy. This latter point is underscored by what I and others find to be a very troubling decision by Secretary Blinken just the other week to remove Nigeria from the list of countries of particular concern for its religious freedom violations. I have joined my criticism of this decision to that voiced by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USAID, Genocide Watch, Open Doors, and numerous other organizations and individuals, including our former Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. Ambassador Brownback encapsulated the concerns when he said, "The sudden removal of Nigeria from CPC is a serious blow to religious freedom in both Nigeria and across the region. Just when we should be doing everything possible to stop the relentless violence that's targeting Christians and others, we do the opposite. This rewards the Nigerian government for tolerating severe religious freedom violations and sends a message to extremists that their actions will continue to go unpunished. People of faith in Nigeria will bear the fallout of this decision, and that's unacceptable," close quote. Indeed, to our observers such as USAID, not only was there no improvement in Nigeria's record to warrant such a removal, the situation appears to have actually worsened. The State Department repeatedly explains conflict in Nigeria by reference a narrative of farmer-herder clashes exacerbated by climate change. That narrative, while not entirely false, is nonetheless incomplete. Primary responsibility for pushing Nigeria to the brink of disintegration lies with President Buhari. He has failed to see himself as having a responsibility to protect all Nigerians, regardless of ethnic or religious background. Indeed, it is telling that violence in the Middle Belt reportedly declined significantly in 2017 when Buhari stepped down for medical reasons for over 100 days and turned governance to the vice president. This presumably because of the sense of impunity which drives Fulani ethno-religious extremists to target non-Fulani diminished when the President Buhari was no longer in office. We need precise data confirming this. I understand that our former Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Robert Destro, had commissioned a study to determine who bore responsibility for the violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt and the scope of the violence, but that this study was allegedly squelched when the administration assumed office last January. And perhaps Secretary Fee could speak to that and maybe resurrect it, because I think we need precise data. We need to understand what is true and why, if answers are not forthcoming, when will they be? As I noted in September, which is part of this conflict that's attributable to the Salafist armed groups, Boko Haram, Islamic State West Africa, and Ansaru in particular, the most significant conflict is attributable to Fulani ethno-religious extremists who target non-Fulani given the perception that they're being given cover by a Fulani president in a Fulani-dominated administration. These targets can be predominantly Christian farmers in the Middle Belt, Muslim or Christian Yoruba in Southwest, Christian Igbos in Southeast, and Shia Muslims in Kaduna. It is significant that Buhari has promoted Fulani in multiple key positions in Nigeria institutions, especially in the military and security apparatus, such as the National Security Advisor, the Inspector General of the Police, the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Minister of Police Affairs, and the Chief of the Army Staff. This extends to other institutions as well, such as Buhari's removal of the Chief Justice of the Nigerian Supreme Court and his replacement by a Fulani individual. This has marginalized other ethnic groups and destabilized the fine ethnic, religious, and geographic balance that is Nigeria. Regarding Ethiopia, and I'll be brief on this, I've repeatedly called upon the State Department, including in questions for the record I sent in March, and I received a reply in August, to take a more even-handed approach to the conflict, which is not simply limited to Tigray, but has extended to Amhara and Afar regions as well as Oromia. Secretary Blinken needs to, in my opinion, fairly call out atrocities regardless of who commits them, something to her credit, which Ambassador Power at USAID has done. As I noted previously, each major ethnic group sadly has both victims and victimizers. The State Department has, for the most part, focused on atrocities by the Ethiopian government and Amhara regional forces, while neglecting equally reprehensible atrocities committed by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which actually precipitated the immediate conflict in November of 2021. I see I'm out of time. I do have additional comments I would like to put into the record. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. To our witnesses, we appreciate you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that your written statements will appear in the hearing record. Under Committee Rule 6, each witness should limit their oral presentation to a brief summary of their written statement. And before I introduce the witnesses, let me acknowledge our former staff director for the subcommittee, Dr. Jeanette Yarwood. It's nice. We'll welcome you back. It's your first time here since moving over to the State Department. Assistant Secretary Molly Fee, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with the rank of Minister Counselor, was sworn in as the U.S. Assistant Secretary for African Affairs on September 30th. She most recently served as the Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation. She was U.S. Ambassador to South Sudan from 2015 to 2017. She previously served as the Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa and as Chief of Staff in the Office of the Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan. Dr. Diana Putman is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for East Africa and for the Office of Development Planning in the Africa Bureau. A career Senior Foreign Service officer, Dr. Putman has spent most of her life overseas and has worked for USAID for 36 years. Most recently, she was the Mission Director in Timor for 3 years, 2016 to 2019. She served before that for 5 years as the Mission Director in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and while overseeing and providing regional services for the Central African Regional Program for the Environment, the Central African Republic, the Republic of the Congo, and Counter Lords Resistance Army activities. I want to welcome you both, and Assistant Secretary, you may begin.
Good morning, Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee, Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Biden-Harris administration's priorities for U.S. engagement in sub-Saharan Africa. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the subcommittee for your long-standing bipartisan support for the important work of the Bureau of African Affairs. I recently joined Secretary Blinken on his first trip to the African continent as Secretary of State. During his trip, the Secretary signaled a fresh approach to U.S.-Africa policy. In meetings in Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal, he shared the following messages. The United States considers the countries on the continent to be major geopolitical players. We acknowledge that they will shape not just the future of Africa, but of the world. We welcome voices from the continent in discussions on global challenges, and we do not seek to limit African engagement with other countries, but to offer them more and better choices that reflect America's competitive advantages. His visit demonstrated that the United States values our relationships in Africa. When delivering his foreign policy address in Abuja, Secretary Blinken announced the White House will host a U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit next year. The purpose of the summit is to elevate our engagement and energize our collaboration on shared goals and priorities. President Biden's fiscal year 2022 budget request is designed to advance these partnerships. We must remain focused on ending the COVID-19 pandemic and improving health security. I know you are closely watching the impact of the Omicron variant. We benefited from the quick action by South African scientists to identify and swiftly report the new variant. A successful global response is not possible without a strong local response, and I commend South Africa's leaders for their transparency and swift action. In coordination with the Africa CDC and the African Union, we are actively working to fulfill our commitment to provide COVID-19 vaccines and other critical supplies. So far, we have provided more than 90 million doses to 48 countries in Africa, with more deliveries on the way. Through the Development Finance Corporation, we're also enabling Senegal and South Africa to manufacture vaccines themselves. This pandemic has underscored the value of historic U.S. investments in supporting African health systems, but has also highlighted the need to better prevent, detect, and respond to current and future health threats. The President's FY 2022 budget request includes critical funding for health programs, including $3.9 billion for PEPFAR. Before COVID-19, Africa was home to nearly half of the world's fastest-growing economies. Today, many of these economies are struggling. By providing more than $1.9 billion in COVID-related assistance for emergency food and other humanitarian support, by supporting the suspension of debt for 32 African countries, and by backing the IMF's allocation of $650 billion in special drawing rights, we are working to ensure African countries have the resources to combat the pandemic and revive economic growth. We are also focused on galvanizing investment from the American private sector to accelerate two-way investment and trade. The President's budget request supports these important priorities, including funding for Prosper Africa and Power Africa. We must also address the disturbing rise of anti-democratic trends. Corruption, lack of transparency, election-related violence, and constraints to freedom of expression undermine societies. As we all know, societies are stronger when the rights of all are represented, including traditionally marginalized communities like women and minorities. The President's budget request includes funding for strengthening democratic institutions and promoting respect for human rights, as well as a request for YALI. Violent extremism seriously threatens African ambitions. The President's budget request also focuses on strengthening the capability of African regional and sub-regional organizations, government institutions, and civil society to address state fragility and armed conflict. Our goal is to help professionalize African security forces, which means helping our partners with training, equipment, and governance, especially by strengthening accountability for instances of abuse. As you know well, stability in East Africa is currently threatened by the devastating conflict in Ethiopia and the assault on Sudan's transition to democracy. And Ranking Member Smith, I hear your concerns about the challenges in Nigeria. Despite these challenges, there are also positive trends and opportunities across the continent which we should also note, including democratic milestones in Zambia and Niger. Underpinning all these efforts are our most important resource, our people. At home and abroad, however, the Africa Bureau faces significant staffing challenges and other constraints which inhibit our work. While we have a responsibility to do better, we would welcome additional input, resources, and flexibilities from Congress so we are able to improve our capabilities to achieve our ambitious agenda and respond quickly to rapidly changing conditions. In closing, let me reiterate the importance and value of this dialogue. I understand the Africa Bureau has a strong record of regular engagement with you and your staff, and I look forward to maintaining that essential tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Putman?
Good morning, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the fiscal year.
I'm not sure if your microphone is on.
Is it working now?
You've spent too much time overseas. You've lost my loud American voice.
I guess so. Is it working now? Okay, good. Yeah, she needed to move it. Okay, good morning, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the fiscal year FY 2022 President's budget request for the U.S. Agency for International Development, Bureau for Africa. For the past 60 years, USAID investments have helped countries across Africa deliver extraordinary progress. They've lifted 700 million people out of extreme poverty since 1990, dramatically reduced deaths from HIV and malaria, stopped Ebola in its tracks, and helped the continent increase primary school enrollment at a rate greater than any region in the world. Africa is a priority for the Biden-Harris administration, as you've just heard. The FY 2022 budget request of $7.428 billion for foreign assistance funding accounts, of which $6.97 billion for accounts fully or partially implemented by USAID, commits the United States to be proactive in the face of numerous challenges and opportunities in the region. Over the next 20 years, the size of Africa's workforce will surpass those of India and China. To meet this growing demand, the United States will continue to expand private sector investment in Africa with commitments to build even stronger, more resilient partnerships rooted in our deepening trade ties. The FY 2022 request of $80 million for Prosper Africa will enhance America's prosperity and security while helping partner countries in Africa expand their economic prospects, open up new markets, spur business creation, and foster competitiveness. The FY 2022 request will enable Power Africa to remain a driver of sub-Saharan Africa's transition to cleaner, renewable energy sources through innovation, financing, commercialization, and deployment of clean energy technologies and infrastructure. Power Africa will deliver against critical administration mandates to address energy poverty and lower greenhouse gases. USAID investments also serve U.S. national security interests. The FY 2022 request will advance strategic partnerships and will promote stability in countries facing or recovering from conflict, such as Somalia and Nigeria. We will also continue our investments in the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, which builds the long-term capacity in West African countries to contain and marginalize terrorist organizations and facilitation networks. In a number of countries across sub-Saharan Africa and indeed the world, we have seen increasing democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism. However, across the continent and indeed the world, data continues to show a demand for democracy. In countries like Sudan, where a fragile path towards democracy was gravely threatened by recent actions by the military, USAID is committed to continuing our long-standing strengthening of civil society and the reforms needed to get back on a path to democracy. Other African countries like Malawi and Zambia have demonstrated that the will of the people will prevail when the institutions of democracy have the space to work. And as African countries continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, USAID will continue to strengthen local health systems and health security. The President's FY 2022 request for Africa allocates approximately $3.85 billion for PEPFAR and $1.61 billion for other health programs, including malaria, tuberculosis, and maternal and child health. The United States will continue to play a leading role in the worldwide response to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the beginning of November 2021, USAID had deployed nearly $1.6 billion to 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa to fight the pandemic and mitigate its social and economic impacts. And the FY 2022 request also includes $111 million to help African nations combat the growing threat posed by climate change. This advances USAID's ambitious plans to assist more than 500 million people in developing countries to adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change. USAID is uniquely placed to address the world's toughest problems and strengthen our global standing. The agency's new diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy will help us create a workplace that lives up to our ideals. The Biden-Harris administration has prioritized Africa and the revitalization of partnerships and alliances based on dialogue and respect. We will continue to work with our partners toward our shared goals. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee. I look forward to responding to your questions.
Let me thank both of the witnesses, and we'll now begin a round of questions with each member allotted 5 minutes to ask questions. I wanted to ask the Assistant Secretary, I believe in your presentation you said that the State Department, with the Africa Bureau specifically, has staffing challenges, and I wanted to know what you meant by that. Do we need to provide more resources? If so, how much? Did you say 800? Jeez.
Yes, it's 801. So, and at the moment, we have nearly 15% which are vacant.
And so is that because, I mean, I certainly remember
Yeah.
traveling to several countries, and it wasn't a question of money, it was a question of people being willing to take those assignments.
That's true. So about half of those posts are historically difficult to staff. It's particularly difficult in situations where officers cannot bring their families, if there isn't appropriate health or educational facilities, or there are
Security concerns.
Right, so that's a big factor. But we also have shortages in the department. And I think as you're all aware, we have real shortages in our chief of missions. We are, right now we have 17 embassies that are led by chargés. We have
You mean because the ambassadors haven't been confirmed, or the ambassadors haven't been proposed?
ambassadors have not been confirmed.
Are they being held up? I mean, I know that a couple of senators are holding, I think Senator Cruz is holding 60 ambassadors.
Right, and of which about 17 are ambassadors to go to Africa. And we, the department has also worked to put about 14 forward for 2022. So we will see, assuming confirmation, we will see a big change in the leadership of our embassies on the continent. And that's also a mechanism for attracting talent, right? People see a leader in a mission and want to go work.
I think this is just a major compromise to our standing internationally. I know that there was a lot of concern when the president went to the G20 that he wasn't bringing the infrastructure package with him. He hadn't gotten that passed. On the other hand, I don't think he had any ambassadors to any of the G20 countries. So this is a problem. I wanted to know if you thought YALI would be able to meet, the YALI participants would be able to come to the States next year, of course, assuming everybody's fully vaccinated, or will it be virtual again? Do you know? The same with the Leader Summit.
Right, we haven't made a decision on either of those yet, pending the health conditions, I think. And of course, it would be the preference, our business is a people business.
Sure,
And that would be
sure.
the preference, but we would need to follow the guidelines of the scientists.
And I also wanted to ask about AGOA and Ethiopia. And I know that we have a warning out to Ethiopia that we might suspend AGOA, and I was wondering what you thought the likelihood of that might be.
Well, the legislation that governs AGOA is extremely well designed because it offers a notification period. So that period expires in January. So it allows the government to take steps to stop the termination of those trade privileges. What we're looking for specifically in line with the statute is action to end the conflict and expand humanitarian access.
Well, I hope that, I mean, I don't know that the conflict is going to be suspended in the next few weeks, but I really hope that the administration reconsiders that, because if we suspend AGOA, you know, it's not going to impact the government. It's going to impact the poor women who work for AGOA, and it impacts our businesses. And I just don't know how we get people to invest, U.S. businesses to invest, if they always have to deal with this threat. So I am hoping that we will not do that. Dr. Putman, I wanted to ask if you could tell me what you're thinking in terms of Prosper Africa and the differences might be in the Biden-Harris administration versus the Trump administration, and is there anything else that we need to provide?
Thank you for the question. I think Prosper Africa is being viewed as our premier trade and investment instrument. And I believe under the Trump administration, that was the case, but it was viewed more as a countering China activity. And I think for the Biden-Harris administration, it is much more part of deepening and strengthening our relationships with African countries and African investors, and encouraging Americans to really see the extraordinary potential in Africa. It's been interesting over the years that we find that when we take trade missions out and we take out some of the pension fund investors and the mutual fund investors, including many who actually, some of whom had already arrived in Cote d'Ivoire for the African Investment Forum, once they get to the continent and they start seeing how vibrant it is and how many opportunities there are there, they get very interested in investing. And so I think we're really going to be promoting as well the aspect of, it's kind of like one-stop shopping. The U.S. government for years has gone out to different countries around the world, particularly in Africa, and said, well, it's way too hard to figure out how to invest in your countries. Well, for American investors, it's really hard to figure out what is needed. And so if you have 17 different agencies in the USG that are working on trade and investment in one shape or another, Prosper Africa provides a secretariat that allows our investors to navigate that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Smith? We'll do a round of 5 minutes, and then we'll come back around again and allow members to ask additional questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Secretary Fee, I would ask you if you maybe could take back a very strong appeal by me and so many others that Nigeria be put back on the CPC list. I would note that Genocide Watch has called Nigeria a killing field of defenseless Christians. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom said it was unexplainable that the U.S. Department of State did not designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. And from inside of Nigeria, the Human Rights Writers Association of Nigeria said, and I quote, "The curious decision of the U.S. government to take Nigeria off the list of countries violating religious freedom came to the Christian community in our country as a, quote, rude shock. They said selective killings of religious worshipers based on their faith are ongoing under the regime of Nigerian President Buhari." And there's one comment after another like that. One bishop who I had at a hearing a year ago said, and that was Bishop Avenya, he said, "The mass slaughter of Christians in Nigeria's Middle Belt by every standard meets the criteria for a calculated genocide from the definition of the Genocide Convention as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group." And others have said similar things. So please, if you could take that back, because I think it could be redesignated tomorrow, and I think that would send a very powerful message. So please, if you would. On South Sudan, if you might speak briefly to that. I only have a few minutes, but you did serve as our ambassador there, and under very trying circumstances. And how are they doing, most importantly, there? And Dr. Putman, if you could just speak to Somaliland. You know, I have met with a number of individuals from Somaliland on frequent occasion. They are a de facto independent country, separate from the rest of Somalia, and yet all aid needs to go through Somalia. And is there a way to try to ensure, for the sake of, I mean, it's one of the reasons why we use NGOs in some countries to make sure when we have to bypass a government, people get the benefits of humanitarian assistance without infringement. And then again, if you have time, if you could speak further to the Ethiopian crisis, which is a catastrophic event that all of us are concerned about.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. Your voice on religious freedom in Nigeria and in other countries is very important for U.S. policy, so thank you for your attention and focus on those matters. And I will take back your concerns. I want to reassure you, I was with Secretary Blinken on his trip to Abuja, and he made very clear to the leadership that the United States remained committed to this fundamental value and that we expected the government to do more, and we will continue to make that a critical component of our engagement in Nigeria. On the issue of South Sudan, I regret to tell you that subsequent to my assignment to South Sudan, there was an effort to revitalize the agreement between the warring parties, and there's been a lackluster attempt to implement the revitalized agreement. The humanitarian crisis remains severe, and I would say that the situation has not met our goals and expectations, and it continues to require our attention and focus. On Ethiopia, this is a really good opportunity for me to make very clear what I think has been mischaracterized in general about U.S. policy. First of all, as we were discussing, the United States, the American people, have long had a relationship with all of the peoples of Ethiopia and with the government of Ethiopia for decades. We strongly support the unity, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We are taking no sides in this conflict. We are doing our very best to end the conflict, which has had such devastating consequences with hundreds of thousands of people displaced, the crash of the Ethiopian economy, and the risk to the stability of the state. So we are working very hard in many diplomatic ways to try and arrest the conflict and to urge the parties to cease the fighting, to expand humanitarian access to all communities who are affected by the conflict, and to begin an inclusive national dialogue. So that's the focus of U.S. policy, and it is simply not true to say that we favor any one side or another. We're quite concerned about atrocities, and we're in looking at atrocities, of course, the first objective would be to end the fighting, which are perpetuating the atrocities. But a second concern is the hate speech. And there is a lot of hate speech among the diaspora in the United States, and we would urge the diaspora to play a responsible role in helping promote a conclusion to the conflict rather than inflaming the conflict. And we're also all conscious of the layers of ethnic hostility over the years that predate the current conflict that are affecting our opportunities. So thank you for allowing me to make that statement on that issue. I think it's important to clarify for all what U.S. policy is towards Ethiopia. Thank you, Mr.
Sir, yes, you know, Somalia is near and dear to my heart. I actually did my doctoral research in Somalia and worked for USAID there, so, and worked both in the north, up in Somaliland, and elsewhere in Somalia. So I hear your question. I will say that we actually provide resources throughout the country. Somaliland does receive resources through NGOs, both on the humanitarian assistance side as well as in terms of our other development activities through our One Somalia policy.
We are going to take a 2-minute recess in order to allow for the clock to be reset. Thank you. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Phillips, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and greetings to our witnesses and fellow colleagues. I want to talk about youth in Africa. 60% of Africans currently are below the age of 25, which is a remarkable opportunity for partnership and growth and prosperity. And understanding the importance of youth as community leaders, recently authored a letter to Secretary Blinken and USAID Administrator Power, supporting youth human rights activists all around the world. And my question to both of you is, how does the State Department and USAID plan to deploy the resources that were allocated in the 2022 budget towards empowering young leaders of tomorrow?
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you very much for highlighting the role of youth on the continent of Africa. I was recently in Khartoum and had the opportunity to meet with some of the resistance committees that have been organizing protests in Sudan, and I think we have all been inspired by their role in standing up to the history of military dominance in Sudan. And it was a great reminder to me of the important role that youth can play all across the continent in challenging sort of outdated political systems and making them more responsive and accountable to the people. I can assure you that in our diplomatic engagement, we prioritize meeting youth, listening to their concerns, and that was something we will continue to emphasize in our public diplomacy. Secondly, we talked a little bit earlier this morning about the importance of commercial diplomacy, and part of the reason commercial diplomacy is so important is to help African economies develop to absorb the youth bulge and make sure there are employment opportunities for them. So those are a few of the ways in which we intend to focus on youth. And now I'll turn to Dr. Putman. Thank you.
Thank you. And Doctor?
Thank you. Yeah, the youth are just amazing on the continent. It is absolutely extraordinary, the level of dynamism when you are out in Africa talking to young people. And so we're deploying the resources both for basic education, really, which remains foundational, and particularly in countries emerging or still in conflict, making sure that we're getting essential literacy and numeracy skills into the hands of young people so that they can take action. But our YALI program, which while it has the Mandela Fellows and it brings people to the U.S., it's the broader network of young African leaders that are just taking such an important role, activating their governments, pushing their governments for services, and delivering services themselves. During the early phases of COVID, one of the things we looked at on a regular basis was when we were all feeling a little bit depressed by being stuck at home, was the kinds of energy and dynamism we were seeing on the part of young YALI leaders in getting people to focus on the pandemic, wear masks, and do social distancing, and then taking that energy into political activism. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate both your advocacy relative to youth in Africa, and hope that the youth coordinator positions at both state and USAID can make sure that young people's perspectives and concerns are included in U.S. foreign policy. With my remaining time, I'd like to address Tigray, of great importance to all of us, to the world. The crisis is heartbreaking. I know you'll agree. I'm curious from both your perspectives, especially you, Secretary Fee, have you seen any change in behavior of the malign actors in Ethiopia since the Biden administration has tried to respond with sanctions and visa restrictions?
I would say we have seen some changes in behavior, but not adequate changes in behavior. In recent days, the government of Ethiopia has allowed, I think it's just over 100 trucks, if that's correct, Dr. Putman can correct me, of humanitarian assistance to make its way into Tigray. But at the moment, the conflict between the parties has intensified, and as you know, the conflict has moved out of Tigray into Amhara and is threatening and into Afar as well, and is threatening other parts of Ethiopia. So I think I'm focused more on the negative side of the ledger in terms of the current conflict, and we're working intensively to try and persuade the parties to reach a cessation of hostilities so they can begin the negotiations to move the state forward. Thank you.
And from your perspective, any other tools available to us, Congress, the administration, to affect the crisis and improve conditions? Is there anything that we can do that you might advise us?
Thank you for that question. First, let me recap some of the activities that are underway. You're aware of Special Envoy Ambassador Feltman, who has been working directly with the parties, both in Addis and through phone contact with the TPLF and with the OLA. We are working to support former President Obasanjo, who is the AU envoy to the Horn, working on this conflict. We're working with critical partners such as Kenya in the region. We're working with our like-minded partners in the international community. We're in discussions in the Security Council. We're in discussions at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. So we're trying to activate all the diplomatic channels that are available to us to press the parties bilaterally and regionally and internationally. The congressional voice making clear what I spoke about earlier, that the United States supports all of the peoples of Ethiopia, supports the unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, and urges all parties to cease this conflict, which is so devastating to the entire country, and to find a path back to unity. I think that would be very helpful to have that echoed by all of us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Secretary. I see my time has expired. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Here we go.
We will now recognize a gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. What happens in Africa is incredibly important, and we are in a competition in Africa for the hearts and minds of the people of Africa because of the intervention with the government by China. So I want to hit two somewhat related projects. FY22 request included the prioritization of Prosper Africa. Now, I understand that was a Trump-era initiative, but it was a Trump-era initiative that increased two-way trade and investment between the U.S. and Africa. How is the Biden administration going to carry out that important program?
Thank you for raising that point. I can tell you on our recent trip when I accompanied Secretary Blinken, it was made very clear to him the interest and appetite of African partners for greater trade and investment by the United States in Africa. And I want to reassure you that Prosper Africa activities under that umbrella are continuing. Everyone recognizes the value of that initiative, and there are efforts underway that Dr. Putman is more directly involved in to try and mobilize and strengthen that important initiative. You also know we have a great tool in the Development Finance Corporation, which was also established in recent years and which is playing an important role on the continent. And just generally speaking, I believe that we would like to use, I spoke in my opening statement about U.S. comparative advantages, and that would be examples such as green technologies. It would be our efforts to promote human rights standards and inclusion of women in investment projects and infrastructure projects. It would be our skill in setting sort of commercial standards and other important regulatory environment that would attract and support U.S. investment. So I just want to reassure you that everyone is committed to doing our best to expand our presence in the continent, both to help African economies develop and, of course, importantly, to help American companies, particularly their workers and their production. Thank you.
To that extent, you listed a number of items you considered to be our advance or benefit. Some of them, in fact, are advantages we give, such as we don't bribe individuals, we don't pay to play, et cetera. But having said that, not bribing a government official and having requirements that empower women and so on do not necessarily get us to the government. What is your plan to get government officials to take advantage? And you mentioned the Development Corporation. I would also add the TDA. Right now, TDA is operating somewhat limited in the region, and there are relatively small amount of planned projects that we're doing, even though they go out for competitive bid. What are you doing in order to get the front end of those programs to American companies so that at least they're in the bidding? And how are you confronting China's willingness to flat pay bribes in many countries?
So, one of the strengths of Prosper Africa is that it brings together the 17 U.S. government agencies that are involved in trade and investment on the continent. And so, as a result, it really does allow us the opportunity to take to our investors overseas and to bring that expertise to Africans. One of the things we're seeing recently is the increasing politicization and publicization of China's crooked or not so great deals in a variety of countries on the continent.
Well, I apologize. I want you to answer that, but I want to expand the question just slightly before my time runs out. I agree with you that if we can make the people of Africa know what has been going on with the government in projects that have failed as a result of those activities, we will have an advantage. Are you leveraging agencies such as the Department of the Treasury and others to give you that information in a way that you can put it out in Africa?
We are starting to do that, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a very important hearing, and I thank you for the time. Yield back.
I certainly agree. Now we will recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses. Assistant Secretary Fee, I just want to start by commending you and the department for the work that you have been doing on Ethiopia, as incredibly difficult and painful as that situation remains, and particularly for the work in recent days to try to reverse the coup in Sudan. I know the Secretary has been personally engaged, and I think it's made a difference. I do want to shift, though, to an issue on which I'm actually quite frustrated with all of us, including with the administration. About 6 months ago, dozens of members of the House wrote to President Biden urging him to launch, in effect, a moonshot effort to vaccinate the world against COVID. We repeatedly reached out to the administration indicating that we were willing to champion large amounts of funding for such an effort, including in the Build Back Better agenda. And we specifically wrote, again, 6 months ago, that if we do not do this, we are likely to see the emergence of variants in developing countries that could come back and hurt the United States, that could potentially defeat the existing vaccines. We were not taken up on any of those offers. And here we are today dealing with a crisis that is on the minds of every single American. In your testimony, you noted that the United States has donated 90 million doses of vaccine to Africa. And again, I know you don't set our global vaccine policy, but I want to start by asking, why do you think that's an impressive number?
I don't know that I would characterize it as an impressive number. It's a factual number of the effort to date. I think we would all agree that it's inadequate, and I would note that Secretary Blinken said this week that it's very clear with Omicron variant that it's now should be undeniable to all of us that if we don't take care of the whole world, we'll never be safe ourselves. And that was also a theme on his trip. He made very clear that in health diplomacy, in health security, in global health systems, if Africans weren't strong, then we would not be strong. So I'll take that, I'll re-emphasize that message.
Well, please do. I mean, I think you know the numbers. I mean, we would need, just to get to 40% vaccination in Africa by the end of the year, which obviously we will not do, we would need about 800 million more doses. We've donated 90. I'm sure you know that more Americans have gotten their booster shots, their third shots, than the number of people who've gotten their first shot in the 8 African countries subject to the travel ban right now. I trust you're not comfortable with that factual situation. But that's a result of choices our government has made. We have effectively an America First vaccination policy that has come back to haunt America, ironically. At current rates of effort, it's a question for either one of you, at what point do you think we will get to the 70% target for 70% of the population vaccinated in Africa? End of 2022, 2023?
I'm not a COVID expert, so I'm not going to speculate on that. I think the two issues that we do often forget about are the capacity of African health systems and the same kinds of issues in terms of vaccination hesitancy that we are seeing in the United States. And so that will affect when we achieve that. Now, there has been a huge effort on the part of USAID and the U.S. government more broadly with CDC and State Department to adjust other funding to strengthen health systems, to get PPE in the hands, to get oxygen in, as well as other things.
I only have 30 seconds. Again, you guys have been robbing Peter to pay Paul, and members of Congress have been offering to provide billions of dollars. And we would have provided billions of dollars in the Build Back Better bill had the administration simply asked for it. That bill is still in the Senate. There are still opportunities. And what I want you all to take back, because I know the Secretary cares deeply about this, is that we have an opportunity still in the next few days, if the President and the Secretary want to seize it, to try to get the funding to do this in the Build Back Better bill. But they're going to have to say so. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Mauser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Yes, Muser for future reference. Thank you. And thank you to our witnesses very much. So you certainly both have a tremendous amount of experience and are in very important positions that will affect the continent of Africa and the whole world. So appreciate you being here. So Africa is on pace to be the fastest growing continent this century. Estimates are that Africa's population to double, which is sort of remarkable, by 2050. Energy consumption in Africa could surpass the European Union around the same time. So my first question is going to surround the natural gas issue. The Biden administration has restricted foreign aid for natural gas projects, even though natural gas is quite plentiful and it is half the carbons of other fossil fuels, as we well know. The president of Uganda recently wrote the article in the Wall Street Journal, which you're very well familiar with, that such restrictions leave many Africans with unreliable and expensive electricity, and stalls progress in agriculture and manufacturing that would reduce poverty and increase productivity. So, Dr. Putman, how is the Biden administration working to provide the right level of funding and focus so as, even if we look at natural gas as a transitionary fuel, at least we make some serious steps forward, while we don't allow, for instance, others such as China to make those investments and yield the benefits and the appreciation of the African nations. So what's going on there? Do we have an agenda of green energy, or are we trying to help these countries prosper?
So our program, Power Africa, has always promoted mutual economic prosperity between the U.S. and African partners by providing technical field experience, innovation, investment, and enabling environment reform. we actually are involved in a wide variety of deals that are brought to us. And many of the deals that are being brought to us happen to be in the area of renewable energy.
I'm having difficulty hearing you. And please, if you just try to answer my question, are we going to be investing in things such as natural gas along with all of the above?
I think it probably depends on what the administration's priorities are and what the deals end up being.
Okay. You know, we got serious issues here, right? And so we need to address them seriously and aggressively. So on to Prosper Africa, for instance. The Russia, China, creating pipelines, and are we engaged in similar? We must be. The two of you have spent a lot of time on the ground in Africa and been studying this for years. You've probably got a great feel for it, much better than I. Are we engaged in things that are important and stopping some of the word games with we don't want to replace China, we want to strengthen our ties? They're really one and the same, but it's okay if that's the messaging you need to use. What matters is the results. So are we engaged in a manner that will actually make a difference, or are we just trying to look good?
You mentioned Prosper Africa, and as we talked about a little bit earlier, there have been over $47 billion worth of deals that have taken place since Prosper started, but also that USAID itself now has a pipeline of about $10 billion in institutional investor deals on the continent. So yes, there's very serious work taking place.
Are you putting together trade missions? Because a lot of times all we talk about is the money, the funding going in, but not the execution of the plan and having us understand what the plan is to achieve the goals. And so that would be helpful to receive as well, actually, what the plan is, besides just appropriating money.
I'm sure we could get you more information, and we can ask the prosecutor.
Okay, and I've limited time, but on the Tigray issue as well, I'd love to hear. Very complicated, I understand, but what's actually being done on the ground, perhaps in detail, specifically. But again, you got serious jobs, and I thank you for your work, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Maybe you can submit an answer to his question in writing to the congressman. We now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. First, I wanted to ask about the administration's long-term focus and strategy in coastal West Africa. Assistant Secretary Fee, could you talk through how you're approaching efforts for preventing instability, conflict, and violence in these countries, particularly as we're watching potential spillover from Sahel-based violent extremist groups into these countries? Which have you assessed as most at risk for increased violence, and why?
Thank you very much for that question, which highlights an important challenge that we face. My first trip to the continent, I went to Accra in Ghana, and then I went to Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso to look closely firsthand myself at this issue. I think what's changed in recent years is that coastal African governments and societies have expressed their concern that the terrorist challenge that Sahelian countries is facing will spill over into coastal West Africa, and they are looking to the United States and to other international partners to help support them in that effort. And part of responding to that challenge is to improve their own situations, particularly ensuring that their own governance is inclusive and responsive to all the communities in their countries, and not, for example, in some countries we see a focus on capitals. So I just want to let you know, because I hope the fact that that was the first area of the continent that I visited highlighted for me that it's an important issue that we need to focus our attention and resources on supporting these partners.
Well, thank you. It does reassure me. I lived in Ghana for a little bit, so it has a special place in my heart. Staying in that same area, though, I want to talk about Guinea. They recently had a coup, and I'd like to know how you're approaching U.S. engagement in Guinea in terms of a risk of protracted political instability. What would you do to improve our engagement in a new strategy for the region and for the country?
Yesterday, I had the opportunity to meet the ambassador from Guinea to the United States, and I've also asked our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Mike Gonzalez, to travel to Guinea this week. And the purpose of both of these engagements was to talk to the transitional government about the importance of moving forward in the coming year to set an electoral calendar and to get Guinea back on track in terms of its return to democracy. We talked about the frustration that the Guineans had with ECOWAS, the regional African organization, that they felt ECOWAS had not done enough to help the previous government do better, and that had contributed to the decision to take a military coup. But I made very clear in my meeting, I've sent a letter to the Prime Minister, which Mr. Gonzalez is going to deliver, that we want to help Guinea get back on track, and we expect them to help us help them by setting an electoral timetable for the coming year. I said we would be willing to mobilize electoral assistance to help them conduct a credible election. They have an interest in revising their constitution. I said we would be willing to support that, and we want to help them put roots down that show that a democratic system can respond to the concerns and priorities of the Ghanaian people. So that's what we're doing to try and help Guinea get back on track.
Well, thank you. Moving over to Mozambique, I want to ask, I was really hopeful to hear that the administration is prioritizing human rights standards in the provision of security assistance to the Mozambican forces, and our engagement with other partner forces like Rwanda. I've talked with some of your colleagues who agree that one of the key drivers of extremism and terrorist recruitment in Mozambique and elsewhere is abuses or perception of abuses by security forces. And given this dynamic and the admin's desire to see an increased stability in the northern provinces, Assistant Secretary Fee, again to you, how does the department plan to work with DoD to ensure that this attention is sustained and not overlooked in the name of short-term security?
First of all, I want to reassure you of the Secretary's personal commitment to this issue. I think both he and I have had experience in other theaters of conflict where it's clear that if security forces cannot act responsibly and maintain and win the trust of communities, that they cannot be successful in restoring long-standing and enduring stability in their countries. We see in Mozambique, as we see in other countries I mentioned earlier, sometimes there's a primary focus on the capital with insufficient attention to provinces and border regions. And so we're working with the government of Mozambique and with partner nations to try and help address the concerns that have given rise to the vulnerabilities in the northern part of Mozambique. And this is, I think, an approach that the Department of Defense, which I can't speak for, but I understand they're committed to, and we will continue to partner with them with that guiding principle.
Well, thank you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank this committee or subcommittee for allowing me to participate. What we're seeing, I think, is a genocide, or at least an attempted genocide, in Ethiopia. We've seen 20,000 soldiers in the Ethiopian army imprisoned months ago simply because of their Tigrayan heritage. We've seen a total media blackout in Tigray. We've seen Tigrayans referred to by top Ethiopian government officials as cancer, weeds, and rats, worthy of extermination. We've seen statements of concern by the UN Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide. The Ethiopian and Eritrean governments have blocked humanitarian aid as up to 900,000 Tigrayans face famine. And recently, over 30,000 Tigrayans in parts of Ethiopia outside Tigray have been herded into concentration camps where God knows what is happening to them. But in addition to the tens of thousands that have been herded into concentration camps, we see hundreds of thousands, at least 900,000, facing famine. And Dr. Putnam, the issue is, why aren't we getting them the food aid? Now, the trucks are blocked, so the first question is about air. We raised this with USAID, and we were told, in part, USAID is airlifting relief supplies to Addis. Well, obviously, the Ethiopian government seems bent on killing as many Tigrayans as possible, so those trucks are not going. That aid is not going to get to the Tigrayan people. Why are we not flying these aid directly into Tigray, into Melke?
The volume of people who need food assistance is enormous, as you've noted.
As was the population of Berlin in 1948.
Nowhere near the same size. In fact, we're talking about needing to get in food for somewhere on the order of 6 to 7 million people across Afar, Amhara, and Tigray. And
now, trucks are being allowed by the Ethiopian government, except into Tigray, as I understand it.
Well, the situation is really fluid, unfortunately.
I understand, but focusing just on Tigray.
So if
you're saying, I mean, you may not be able to save all the people, but every plane can save thousands of people. Why are we not flying in aid?
There are sort of two reasons. We are continuing to work on trying to get access for our trucks, which would take a much greater
Why are
volume.
we not flying in
And I'm
aid?
about to answer, sir, that first of all, there have been airstrikes recently, and we haven't been seeing planes going into Tigray.
So you're
in
afraid the
order to-
Ethiopian government would shoot down American planes? Would they dare to do that? Assistant Secretary, what would be our reaction if an American aid plane were fired upon by Ethiopian forces bent on killing as many Tigrayans as possible and killing Americans in order to do it?
Obviously, that would not be an acceptable response from a government that has historically been our partner, but I want to...
Is the U.S. Air Force willing to protect American or UN planes as they bring critically needed supplies necessary to prevent this genocide by famine?
That would be a decision that would, of course, be taken above my...
I would hope that you would consult Secretary Blinken.
Yes.
I remember the Clinton administration's reaction after Rwanda of wishing we had done more, and there's clearly we can do more than we are. As to the trucks, it seems as if the Eritrean and Ethiopian military are determined to make sure that they don't reach Eritrea. How many trucks have been allowed in by those two militaries in the last month?
We're trying.
I assume a very tiny number compared to the need.
Yeah, we're trying not to worry so much about the trucks, but sort of the volume of aid.
Is the volume of aid?
Provided, and the volume of aid, we've only had in the last month about 11% of the volume of aid that would be required.
11%.
There was
And Assistant Secretary, have we even asked, because I know what the answer would be, the Eritrean government to simply allow us to land food at the Eritrean ports and to have our trucks go directly into Tigray?
As you know, our relationship with Eritrea is very negative at the moment, given the Eritrean...
But it would be nice to ask and have them say, no, we would like to have blood on our hands. We want to see as many Tigrayans as possible die from famine. We will not allow our ports to be used. Just to put it on the record, so that I don't seem that unreasonable when I say that maybe somewhere on the high seas, a ship bound for Tigray should be asked to turn around by a U.S. naval ship. The fact that Eritrea would use its military to intervene in order to commit a genocide on the Tigrayan people, and what is obvious to all is to blockade a starving people. We may not have absolute proof of where they deploy their soldiers, often in out of uniform or out of their own uniform, but every Eritrean port is closed to food aid. Let's send them a letter just so we get it on the record. But to say that Eritrea should be able to carry out ocean trade with all the countries of the world while participating in this genocide and blockading those who are dying of starvation it strikes me as unfair.
Mr. Congressman?
Yes.
Just to reflect the very important point and very legitimate concern you've raised, I just want to flag the sanctions that the U.S. government has imposed on the Eritrean parastatals that are funding this conflict.
We're not in a position to, we often sanction people who can't, and entities that can't be sanctioned. Eritrea has little relationship with us. We don't give them much aid. So then we announce we're taking away the minuscule or non-existent aid, and we say we've done something. It's reminiscent of the sanctions we imposed on the Russian hackers in our election, where we said we're not going to give them tourist visas. They don't want to come. It's hard to identify a major economic impact of our sanctions to date on Eritrea, whereas simply asking a single ship to turn around would send a hell of a signal. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Again, I'm really grateful that we are having this conversation. Thank you all for being here with us. And also really grateful to my colleagues for asking really insightful and critical questions. Ms. Fee, we recently announced a travel ban on some African nations. The South African president has called the decision completely unjustifiable. We know that it was South Africa that sequenced this new variants, and instead of lauding them for this achievement, it appears that we are punishing them. How are you messaging this to the region, and what responses are you all giving to the president, and how are you justifying the fact that we have not banned other countries outside of Africa that also have this variance in their countries?
Thank you for the question. We value greatly our health partnerships with African countries, particularly South Africa, where we started the PEPFAR program in 2004, and where we continue to work closely, including recent DFC investment, so South Africa can manufacture its vaccines.
I just want to hear how diplomatically you are talking to them about this. I do know that we value their relationship.
Well, I just meant that in the context of our engagement, Secretary Blinken called the foreign minister following this decision to make clear to her that the decision was taken out of an abundance of caution and to publicly praise the role of South African science.
Why isn't that abundance of caution taken for the other countries outside of the African countries that we've banned that also have the variants?
That's an important question, which I'm not best situated to answer, as I'm responsible for countries in Africa. So we can take that back for you. Thank you for raising it.
All right. I also wanted to bring your attention to a recent New York, the New Yorker recently reported that this week that the European countries are collaborating to send African migrants to detention centers in Libya. Many of us have in this committee talked about how there is modern day enslavement that's taking place in Libya. In these prisons, people are subjected to severe brutality. Some of them are being sold off, as it's been documented. What are you doing to protect the human rights of African migrants in Libya? And are you engaging with our European allies and messaging to them that this is unacceptable and they have to reverse course?
We do remain in dialogue with the EU, and in fact, the EU Foreign Secretary will be here tomorrow, and that's an opportunity for us to raise this important topic. My understanding is that we do have implementing partners in Libya that are working to address the conditions in those camps, but I'm not in command of those details, but I'm happy to provide them to you.
Tomorrow we're having a briefing with IOM on the migration crisis that's taking place. I invite my colleagues to join us for that briefing so that people can learn about and that we can try to come up with proper actions that can be taken by Congress here. Dr. Putman, I wanted to ask you about the decision to freeze the $700 million in funding to Sudan in the wake of the coup. What are the conditions on which that funding would be fully restored? In other words, what does USAID consider the important markers for the transition being back on track? And how are you managing to maintain support for the Sudanese civil society during this freeze?
Thank you for that question. As you know, there is the $700 million that we froze, but we are also looking at some of the funding that had already been notified to Congress and we had been told we could use. So we had $30 million that was going to the Office of Transition Initiative activities, some of which had been working with the Sudanese government. So we have stopped any activities with the Sudanese government, and we're pivoting the use of that money to work with Sudanese civil society and human rights groups and other sorts of activities. And then additionally, in terms of the markers, it's under discussion right now within the interagency, and we'll certainly be consulting with Congress before we make any decisions on resumptions of assistance.
Thank you. And with that, my time has expired. We are now going to start second round of questioning. I am going to recognize Mr. Muser for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chairwoman. I just want to go back for a moment to the article in the Wall Street Journal, the president of Uganda, where he said many Africans will leave many Africans with unreliable and expensive electricity, taking the path of focus on renewable energies exclusively. What is the State Department's position on that? Is he wrong? Or do you agree with it? Did you pay notice to it? Is the State Department saying, he's got a point? Assistant Secretary Fee?
I want to thank you for highlighting this challenge, which is a challenge specifically in Africa, but I would argue globally. But given the historic underdevelopment in Africa and the hungry desire, naturally, of peoples and governments to expand their infrastructure and provide the energy needs that would fuel development, this tension about how to manage moving towards a greener and safer world and the need for development is quite acute. When we were in Nigeria and Senegal, leaders raised the same concerns that President Museveni raised. So it is a challenge we are going to have to grapple with. There are real efforts to look for offsetting actions that these governments can take, for example, in Nigeria, to cap methane emissions while Nigeria deals with its own gas transition. Senegal is also in a similar position on gas transition. So I just want to acknowledge that you're quite right to put your finger on this. It's a challenge that we're going to have to manage.
You're doing your best to have a very reasonable, sound, effective approach. That's what it sounds like. So next I want to discuss Nigeria. Representative Smith invited me a couple of months back, I guess, to his office, and he had a number of members of the Nigerian parliament in his office, and it was quite an illuminating and interesting conversation. Also, it was very concerning, to say the least. Many of these, and I think it was all gentlemen, were in fear for their lives as well as their lives of their family. They were being very specific as to some of the raids taking place at the day of that they were visiting the U.S. So clearly they were very upset about that. So now that's happening, and yet just what was it, last week, the State Department removed Nigeria from the list of countries of particular concern for religious persecution. So again, Assistant Secretary Fee, please just explain, and I could speculate what some of the various issues going on and what the overall goal is here by doing that. But can you try to be, in 2 minutes here, explain to us how that decision was made, and be as specific as you can as to how that's going to improve things?
The decision was made based on a legal determination that the government of Nigeria is not engaged in, the language of the statute is engaged in or tolerated severe violations of religious freedom. As you know, that doesn't mean that we're not concerned about the issue of religious freedom, and that's something that we have and will continue to emphasize. Nigeria is an enormous country with a population that is nearly equally divided between Christian and Muslim, and in fact has a long and proud history of religious coexistence. The country is under enormous stresses right now with real acute security challenges from Boko Haram and ISIS. They have enormous population challenges. They have enormous economic challenges. And so they're also affected by climate change. And when Congressman Smith spoke about this, Ranking Member Smith spoke about this, he noted and acknowledged those challenges, but said that they weren't an adequate explanation for transgressions against religious freedom. And we would agree that that's an important concern that we need to continue to focus on. But I think it is helpful to understand the broad range of factors that constitute the complex country of Nigeria, which affect and inhibit actions that we would like to see. But I want to, again, emphasize our commitment to religious freedom and to helping Nigeria treat its population correctly.
And I'm out of time, so I don't want to go over my time, but is there carrot and stick taking place? Are we saying, hey, the human rights issues are for real, they're happening, yet we want to recognize Nigeria and work with you in the best way possible? Okay. All right. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
You can provide an answer for that. Yes.
Yes, exactly, Congressman. That, I think our goal is to help improve the situation. And in that effort, voices such as yours and as Ranking Member Smith's to make clear that this is an ongoing and enduring concern of the United States will be an important factor in how we approach the topic. But I again want to emphasize that there's no neglect of this issue. It will be a vital component of our ongoing engagement.
Thank you. Ms. Fee, I wanted to ask, when will the Secretary complete the legal review of atrocity designation in regards to Ethiopia? We've been waiting for months.
As I have discussed here today, our primary focus has been on trying to engage diplomatically in the many ways that are available to us to reach an end to the conflict, which would obviously result in an immediate end of the atrocities. And so we have decided to refrain at the current moment from making a public determination in order to allow space and time to see if the talks that are currently underway can make progress. but I want you to know that we have undergone an active and dynamic determination process. It's ongoing as we continue to assess emerging reports of human rights violations and abuses, and we remain committed to seeing what we can do to address the current elements that have caused all of us such concern. We have also engaged Facebook and Twitter. I've spoken here today to ask the diaspora to consider how it discusses the situation. And we are quite concerned as well by hate speech by the government and other elites in Ethiopia. And I think we need to call on everyone to do better to address that situation.
Thank you. There's also increasing reports that the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, China, Iran are arming the Ethiopian government with drones and other weapons. Isn't it time to be pushing for an arms embargo? And in the meantime, shouldn't we pushing our allies to stop arming Abiy's government?
Absolutely, the issue of arms supplies to Ethiopia is a component of our diplomacy with regional and international allies, and the issue of an arms embargo is one of the many elements of the discussion taking place in New York in the Security Council.
There's also mass migration that is happening in Ethiopia. Millions of people have been displaced. It's contributing to the crisis that's taking place in Sudan. We obviously are seeing many of these migrants enter Libya that are being brutalized. We're also seeing what's happening in Europe as some of them are facing heart conditions as they try to enter the border of some of those the European countries. What is the U.S. involvement in trying to mitigate this situation and provide humanitarian assistance?
The subject of Ethiopia has been a subject of immense focus and concern since the Biden-Harris administration took office. In the early months of the administration, they appointed Jeff Feltman as envoy. We continue to be active in Addis with other parties to the conflict who we can reach outside of Addis. As I mentioned before, we're working with the African Union. We're trying to support President Obasanjo. We're working with Kenya and other influential partners in Africa. We're working in the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council. We work with our like-minded partners in Europe. There is a real sustained effort to try and arrest this conflict because of the devastating consequences that you've just described in your intervention.
And I hope those efforts are being handled with the urgency that it deserves. I believe Ethiopia is too big to fail, and it's the possibility of it destabilizing the whole region just breaks my heart. Speaking of the East African region, we know that Somalia has failed to have elections for over a year now. That conflict still is happening. What is the U.S. position on trying to pressure the Somali government to engage in a process that allows for proper elections to take place?
So we agree with you absolutely that the elections are critical, first to complete the parliamentary elections so that the stage is set to move to the presidential elections. That is a component of our engagement with the government, all parties in Somalia, and with all the many regional and international actors who are also active in Somalia so that there's a unified message. We're also looking now, as you know, the AMISOM mandate is about to expire, and we're looking at how that mandate can be reconfigured to support both the political process and the fight against al-Shabaab. There is no neglect of that situation. It remains tough to convince the parties to move in the right direction. There has been some progress in the parliamentary elections, but there needs to be more, and it needs to be done more quickly to help Somalia get on a path to self-sufficiency. So that is an area of active discussion, again, with Somali leaders and with our partners in the African Union and in Europe who are financing part of the AMISOM conflict.
And to my colleague's point earlier with the carrot and stick, what what mechanisms are we utilizing to make sure that Somalia understands what our position is in regards to this and takes the proper course?
I think one of the lessons that we learned from Afghanistan, that I personally learned and that Secretary Blinken learned, doing more of the same is not necessarily sufficient. So there's a real effort to make clear to the Somalis that they cannot depend indefinitely on international assistance and that they need to play a role in leading and managing their own country. So that is a spirit that is infusing our approach to Somalia.
I certainly agree. And with that, I want to thank both of you for your time, for your commitment to the continent, and for providing answers for us today. With that, the committee is adjourned.